By high summer, the tower had taught me the shape of each day. Heat arrived early, like a slow hand on the back, and the first cicada rasp stitched the timber before the sun had cleared the next ridge. I woke to the light banding the bunk rail and the wind's timid touch against the shutters, checked the water level in the barrel, and thumbed the latch on the hatch door as if it could forget its job while I slept. The place was 40 feet of ladder above thin duff and a ring of granitic shoulders. Each shoulder wore its own name on our map, but the map names never captured the way they hoarded weather. I logged the first entry on the slate. Date, 0704, start, sky mostly clear, a smear of high cirrus to the west, temperature in the upper 60s. The wind should have been a gentle southerly at that hour, nothing to worry a dry cone or lift the needles into a whisper. I stepped onto the catwalk and watched the little vane of the wind gauge quiver. It didn't know the south from its own shank. It pointed north-northeast, then held as if it had decided. I tapped the post with my knuckles and watched again. Still north-northeast, steady as a line drawn by a sure hand. I took it as a morning joke from the valley until I set the Osborne firefinder on the exact center mark and let the ring settle under my palm. You can learn a country by setting azimuths and letting your wrist remember the weight of that metal disc. My circle is a promise. Between the center and the edge, the tower becomes a compass that never forgives dramatics. I made a slow sweep. West to the old burn scar at 262 degrees, north to the notch we called Coyote Gate at 17 degrees, east to the long ribbon of mixed lodgepole and larch, where stumps sat like dull candles, then south along a descending shoulder that funneled weather. I glassed each sector with the field glasses, taking time until my eyes warmed to distance. Nothing moved but a hawk testing thermals that weren't ready yet, and a single contrail shearing into chalk. Routine turns a person into a series of small, careful acts. I cranked the radio once to wake its battery, listened to the brief hum and the hollow click of the hand generator settling, then gave a call. Lookout Echo 4, morning check. Dispatch answered with the dry calm of someone practiced at speaking into rooms they couldn't see. We confirmed channels, the time tones, and the first patrol on the South Trail scheduled for noon if the heat stayed honest. I noted it on the slate with the stub of a pencil that always tasted faintly of cedar when you bit a mistake out of your lip. After coffee, I walked the catwalk again. I watched the treetops below for the little ticks of wind. A north-northeast flow this early didn't fit. Nights sometimes poured cold air down our drainage like invisible water and left a puddle of chill. Mornings traded those pools for a slow rise. But the needles were leaning the wrong way. I rested my fingers on the railing and felt the wood's faint tremor. Not gusts, those have a human rhythm, breaths and pauses, but something even, like a machine spin without the machine. I closed my eyes to let the skin of my face take the measure the way an old hand had taught me. The air on the left cheek should have warmed first as the sun ticked the east, and yet the first warmth arrived on the right. I wrote it down as if a note could persuade the day to line up. Wind steady NNE since 0710, no gusts, even pressure on cheek, feels deliberate. I crossed out deliberate. Weather doesn't plan, it collects. At 0903, a scent passed that belonged to another month. It was the faint sweetness you catch on the first wet day after a long dry, a ghost of petrichor without any rain to own it. The sky was a hard, honest blue. I could see 30 miles clean. No build of cumulus, no thunder columns collapsing into outflow. The smell arrived, wavered, and slid away like a notebook page lost out the window of a moving truck. I recorded it anyway and watched the ridge at 2 to 12 dash where the last big storm had broken a snag and left its pale heartwood showing. The snag did not move. The light on it did, in a way that made my stomach choose to ignore itself. By mid-morning, the radio carried the small lives of other people. A trail crew noting a washed-out culvert, a plane checking in, one tourist's bad decision converted into a ranger's measured warning. My work stayed quiet, just the increments of the finder ring and the little notes in the margin about heat mirage that made a far boulder blink in and out as if an eyelid covered it. The wind gauge kept its arrow where it liked. I checked the aneroid barometer mounted inside, a brass-lipped thing with numbers smaller than felt decent. The needle had eased down a fraction, we usually wouldn't brag about. Heat alone can soften pressure, but the drop paired with that wrong wind felt like two people who didn't know each other arriving to the same porch and pretending it was a coincidence. When the sun made the catwalk boards release that dry pine scent, I went below to inspect the clearing. A lookout is only as good as the small circle you control. The fuel box was sealed, the shovel hung on its nail, the pecan sat where it wouldn't be kicked. I circled the tower base and saw prints in the dust that mapped an old fight between a chipmunk and its shadow. Along the shadow line on the north side, the dust kept a story of last night's breeze. Tiny trails pushed into parallel. This morning's should have overlaid them in the opposite direction. Instead, the new lines wrote over the old in the same hand. Back up top, I set the firefinder again and held a long azimuth on 017° Coyote Gate, the notch that makes wind into a whistle on bad days. I watch for the fine thread of smoke you get when a careless camp stays too happy after the dollar store lighter dies. No smoke. But the heat shim behind the notch moved with that steady speed. No raggedness, no tumble like thermal bubbles. It streamed east like someone had laid a sheet of glass in still water and decided to slide it in a measured way. A thing can be both subtle and obviously wrong. I tried a little test I don't write down often because it sounds superstitious. And superstition turns a tower brittle. I held my palm flat above the compass bezel on the Osborne and kept my eyes on the far tree line. When the wind gusts, your hand catches it as a light press, and the tree line answers with a ripple you can time. No gust touched my hand, yet the far larch bent together as if a single breath had chosen them, and them alone. I watched the bend travel along the line of larch and stop where the mixed spruce began, a marching halt as clean as a fence. Echo 4, status? Dispatch's voice broke the little corner I had made for myself. Status green, I said, because everything you can name was still where it should be. Wind steady from NNE, little unusual for this hour, no visible smoke, barometer easing. I let the next word sit on my tongue, then spoke anyway. Localized motion in larch line east, not matched elsewhere. Copy, she said, not as if she didn't believe me, but like she was filing a fact whose label would be decided later. Heads up the valley's inversion layered longer than forecast. Could be your oddities. Could be, I said, and wrote inversion in the margin. A label comforts the hand. The mind knows when it's dressing the wrong wound. At 11:26, the first hint of a smear appeared on the far south ridge, low and pale, the kind you almost call a cloud, and then don't. I marked the bearing, 192°, distance unknown, probable dust. The wind should have carried it toward the basin. It curled instead and pressed against the ridgeline as if reconsidering. Through the glasses, the smear almost took texture, a faint corduroy pattern, like a field seen from height. It faded before I could decide what pattern it was. The larch to the east did their synchronized bend again, and this time I heard a thin sound ride along them. Not a whistle, not a rustle, a steadied hush, a taut thread drawn across wood, and let go without the tone a string owes the world. Noon put its hand flat on the roof. The patrol would start down the south trail out of the ranger station if plans held. I pictured two figures shrinking into the heat chatter, heads bowed into their own work. I ate quietly, my back against the north window frame, the crank radio resting on my knee like a dog waiting for a word. On impulse, I turned the handle twice and set it on the shelf. It doesn't need the charge when the generator is good. It hummed anyway, a very faint regular breath. I checked the power switch, off. I picked it up. The hum faded as if I had embarrassed it. When I set it down again, the hum returned and kept time with nothing I could count. Afternoon would bring honest thermals and honest wind if the day remembered itself. I closed the entry with a note that meant nothing to anyone but me. Planned, unplanned, both keep time. The hand that wrote it paused over the slate as if it could choose a different day by hovering. Down in the timber, a darker green pooled where the spruce began. The pool took a small step sideways and then stayed a pool. I would have blamed my eyes, but my job makes you careful with what you blame. I set the Osborne sight back to 0 and let the ring rest. I told myself to wait for one clear sign you could hand to another person without needing to teach them your skin first. That's the rule. Don't call a thing until it can stand without you. The wind ticked the gauge vane once like a finger on a glass, and then held steady from the wrong quarter, patient as a thought you don't yet have words for. By early afternoon, the light went glassy, the kind that makes distance feel closer than it is, and every ridge looked like it has been ironed. Thermals finally got honest over the basin. I watched hawks stack themselves into loose spirals and drift, and I let the pattern calm the part of me that had taken offense at the morning's north-northeast. The wind gauge still held its needle where it preferred. The catwalk board stayed warm under my boots, and the tower hummed with its simple usual creaks. I told myself that odd mornings often settle into ordinary days, and that if I kept to my method, the day would choose to be legible. I set the Osborne firefinder to a neutral 0, loosened the clamp, and began my longer sweep. It's a comfort, that slow turn. Steel, glass, the exactness of a hairline crossing a landscape you know better than your own handwriting. West was clean, the old Burns snag bright and chalky. North over Coyote Gate pulsed with heat shimmer, but nothing with the density of smoke. East stayed a run of timber leaning to larch that remembered its trick of moving as one, and then pretended it hadn't. I let the ring keep turning south, out over the shoulders that stepped down to the far country. That's where I caught it, a pale finger faint as breath on a mirror, lifting just beyond the second ridge. I stopped the ring, tightened the clamp, and put my eye to the sight. The finger wasn't a column yet, more the idea of a column, a pale smudge rising and unspooling. I read the azimuth at 193 degrees and said the number out loud so it would sit in the room with me. Through the field glasses, I found a trio of granite blisters that always look like sleeping animals, and used the middle one as a reference. The smear held its place relative to that. I glanced to the wind gauge out of habit. Its arrow still insisted on north-northeast. Any smoke that far south should have skated east by now, thin and eager. Instead, it seemed to rise and hesitate, and if it drifted at all, it drifted back toward the ridge like a hand unsure of leaving a doorknob. The log slate took the note, 1318, 193 possible smoke, faint. I forced myself to wait half a minute, enough time to watch for an honest build or a trick of heat. The smudge thickened very slightly, enough to become a color you could argue about with another person. It didn't darken toward brown, didn't show that oily bottom that fast fires wear when they find duff. It stayed gray-white and polite. Echo 4, possible smoke, I said on CH1, voice steady, the way I had been taught. Bearing 193 from Echo 4, just beyond second ridge, low, faint column. Echo 4, copy possible, dispatch answered, and I could hear her lean forward to mark a dot on a map I'd never see. Any drift? Minimal, I said, because I wouldn't say none. Wind locally steady NNE, anomaly persists. Column is not behaving per wind expectation. Understood, she said. Any ground confirmation options near your bearing? Negative from here without committing a long walk, I answered. This was the moral pressure that comes with the job. Call too early and you waste people's time chasing a mirage. Call too late and you explain to people in a different tone. Request cross-check from Foxtrot 2 if in position. Stand by, she said. I kept the ring clamped and the glasses fixed while the seconds did their work. The column sharpened by degree, enough that I could tell it had a waist to it, the place where heat meets cooler air and decides a shape. I checked to the aneroid. Pressure had eased another hair's width. Heat alone could account for it in a summer like this. Heat, inversions, the 1,000 little habits mountains keep for confounding your best guess. I ran a quiet test with myself. I sighted just above the column and swept slowly left and right. If there had been a logging operation, a road cut, a dust devil with ambition, I should have picked up lateral activity. Nothing moved with that kind of speed. The column remained in its place like a mark on glass. Echo 4, dispatch came back. Foxtrot 2 is on the line of sight from their northwest slope. They don't have your column. Their bearing to your blisters is 201. Visibility good. They're seeing clear air above the second ridge. I looked again to make sure my eyes belonged to me. The smear was there. If anything, it was more convincing for having refused to hurry. Copy, I said, and then added the word I didn't want. Unconfirmed. Hold observation, dispatch said, just as calm. Aircraft Tango might route over your sector in 20. If column builds, call probable. The radio clicked off and left the tower to itself. I breathed through the little rise of temper that comes with doubt. Then I lifted the glasses and leaned the elbows just so on the catwalk railing to settle the shake. The pale column pulsed like a slow breath. The needles of the larch line to the east ticked in unison again, a courteous bow. I looked down at the crank radio on its shelf. I hadn't touched it since morning. Still, I could imagine the faint hum if I brought it near my ear. I left it alone. I needed my hands for the work I could name. I decided to build a reference for myself. I sighted the base of the column against a notch in the ridge and marked a pencil dot on the south window glass at the exact edge position. The old lookout who trained me called this poor man's parallax. If a thing truly lives in the world, It will slip across your dot as the day moves. If the world is playing with heat and light, sometimes the thing and the dot will keep each other too much company. I waited. The sun inched, shadows slid, and the gray finger moved, but it moved wrong, not with the sun's slow push across land, but in time with slight thickening and thinning, as if it had a life of its own, and the ridge were set dressing. At 1339, a smell came up the tower that put my mouth full of old coins. It wasn't the woody tang you get when a lightning-struck snag smolders and sends its first apology into the air. It was cleaner, a laboratory kind of sterile, like damp paper dried too fast. My tongue wanted to say it was rain on dust again, but there was no rain and no damp. I wrote smell metallic paper, transient, direction indeterminate. The wind on my cheek said north-northeast. The smell didn't care for that information. I unclamped the Osborne and walked the ring to 193 degrees again to make sure I hadn't let the sight drift. It read true. I read the angle to the hawk circling above, and did the little mental math that keeps you from marrying a mirage. Hawk's path did not cross the column. Its shadow passed clean over the ridge and never smudged. The column did not cast a shadow I could see, and that bothered me in a small, pedantic way that I would not mention to anyone else unless they asked in the exact right tone. Echo 4, Foxtrot 2 broke in on our shared channel, wind loud on their side. We've got a line on your second ridge. Nothing. If you can give a landmark beyond, we'll swing. Stand by, I answered, and I pulled the field glasses from my eyes to rest them, and looked train hard with bare sight. The granite blisters slept where they always slept. Beyond them, the slope broke to a paler apron that on certain days gleams like fish scales. Today it was a dull skin. The column rose from somewhere behind that apron. Reference is the middle blister in the trio south-southwest, I said. Your bearing 201 to the trio matches mine. The column is just to the right of that middle blister from my position. Copy, Foxtrot 2 said. We'll hike 40 meters east and re-sight. I kept the finder clamped, the pencil dot in the corner of my eye, the wind gauge a stubborn reminder. The catwalk railing warmed my forearms. Somewhere below a jay scolded until it choked on its own impatience. The column thinned, then fattened, but never committed to the deepening that would free me to say the word probable. The smell didn't return. The larch in the east bowed once more like a drilled company. I heard, very faint, a thread of tone rise and fall in the tower itself. Not in the radio, not in the glass, a wood note, as if the studs had decided to resonate with a pitch the day favored. I set the heel of my hand on the frame to feel it. The vibration ran even, almost a lullaby, except lullabies belong to known things. At 13:58, Foxtrot 2 returned. Echo 4, at our new spot the air stays clear. No column. We've got heat shimmer only. We advise hold without call-up unless build. Copy, I said, keeping any salt out of it. The column, to punish me for being polite, decided then to show its best face. It brightened, found a waist again, and became for 10 seconds a line that any trainee could have called. I stared, counted to 10, and raised the mic. Before my thumb found the transmit, the line undid itself like breath on cold glass and left nothing in the sight but the ridge, a hawk, and a blank piece of sky. Echo 4, I said after a beat that no one could measure. Column intermittent, no build, holding observation. Roger, dispatch said. Aircraft Tango ETA 12. If you can maintain visual until then, we'll let them sweep your sector. I can maintain, I said. I put the slate down, flexed the cramp out of my writing hand, and took one long look with the glasses until the world grain broke into points of light. The pencil dot on the window hung there like a promise I couldn't redeem. I wiped it off with the side of my thumb, rather than let it accuse me for the rest of the shift. The wind gauge arrow shivered once, as if reconsidering, and then stayed with its north-northeast. Along the east, the larch forgot to bow. The column, if it had ever been, was gone. I set the firefinder back to 0 and let the ring rest. In the absence of smoke, the room seemed to get smaller, as if the air itself had stepped closer to listen for what I would do next. I wrote one last line to pin the moment. Possible smoke presented and withdrew. Behavior contrary to wind. No confirmation. It looked innocent there in graphite. It didn't say anything about the way the tower had hummed in a human cadence, or the way the smell had put the taste of pennies behind my teeth, or how the hawk's shadow refused to speak to the column when it should have introduced itself. The afternoon kept its brightness. Somewhere west, a truck on the old road shifted gears and multiplied itself into echoes. If you had asked me then whether the day had decided, I would have said, not yet. I would have said we were still in the part where facts line up and refuse to salute. The hour between 2 and 3 is when the country holds its breath and pretends it never learned fire. Heat levels, shadows crisp up, the map looks truer than it is. I kept the Osborne at rest and let my eyes do the work. A ring can't. Soft focus first, then tighten to points. No column where the gray finger had teased me. The wind gauge still held north-northeast like a vow. My slate from the last hour sat open beside the crank radio, and the pencil had made a hollow in its own niche from being set down and picked up so often. Echo 4, tango over your sector in 8, dispatch said. We'll paint the ridges south and give you a call on the pass. Copy, I said. I straightened the field glasses strap, more ritual than need, and walked the catwalk one more time. The larch line to the east, my chorus line, stood still. A J threw itself into a rant and then choked it off mid-note, like it had heard a thing it preferred not to translate. I set the Osborne again to sweep east, not for smoke, but to measure the honesty of my own bearings. The ring slid smooth. The sight rode across the larch tops and then the mix of spruce. I sighted a snag at Luro 79 digs I used to tune my hand. Broken leader, 3 raptor perches in a row like notches. The hairline laid clean across the middle notch. I tightened the clamp and leaned down to make my note when something small, nothing a story would keep, made me look back. The hairline had crept a thread's width south without the ring moving. A draft can rock a body and trick an eye. I know that trick, and the counter trick. I set the palm of my hand on the ring to feel movement. No shift. I looked again. The hairline sat half a degree off its perch. I didn't write that. I told myself I'd jostled the floor with my heel. I breathed once and recited. The notch and the hairline met again like friends who pretend their earlier argument never happened. A sound came then, thin and tight. Not from the radio, not from the wind, more like the sound you get when static gathers to jump, but decides to wait. It seemed to live in the timber east, the way a kettle whistle lives in a kitchen doorway before the note rounds out. I held stock still to separate it from Tower Creek and loose screw songs. The sound steadied, then feathered the needles as if they were wires in a low, invisible current. The larch line bowed, the courteous nod I was learning to dread. When the needles eased back, a little crackle ran the tops like sugar poured on paper. Dry air, hot day. Pines will speak on days like that, but usually in fits, with breeze to carry the consonants. This was even, like a tone you can't hear announcing itself in punctuation marks. The crank radio on the shelf clicked in sympathy. Not the click of a switch, but the tiny tick of a capacitor thinking. I thumbed its power to make sure I wasn't cheating. Still off. I picked it up. The tick stopped. Set it down. It resumed, slow as a leaking faucet. Echo 4, tango 1 minute out, dispatch said. They'll call you on approach. Yet I stepped to the south window and lined the Osborne on Wendy Threedig, my phantom column's bearing, because you owe the day the courtesy of meeting it where it last spoke. I lifted the glasses and found the trio of granite blisters and their pale apron. No column. The air above the apron had a faint, regular shimmer that looked less like heat and more like someone was moving a clear sheet back and forth at a steady tempo. A hawk, not the one from earlier, a wing nick missing from the left, rode a thermal to my north and then cut across the east. As it crossed the larch, the thin static lifted like hair and then dropped. The hawk's flight did not falter. The aircraft came in from the west, low enough to show its belly numbers in chalk flash. Their first call broke over our shared channel, with the clipped comfort of people who fly so often their voices learn to keep a level altitude. Tango to Echo 4 on your south run. Ridgeline 2 miles, no visible column. We're getting unusual ground shimmer near your 195 to 205 sector. Could be mirage. We'll circle. Echo 4 copies, I said. I've got the same shimmer. Wind anomalous here. Steady NNE. Tango copies, the pilot said, and the engine notes swung with their turn, a clean arc. We'll do an east-west at 8,000 and again at 75. Their second pass crossed over my larch line, and the static in the needles braided itself into a thin hiss that found the tower studs, a note too high to be polite. The hair on my forearms lifted like it was practicing something. I moved a hand toward the metal window latch and felt a soft, dry sting step from latch to skin 3 times, patient as a count. Ozone should have a smell, a little sharpness like a fresh photocopy. What came instead was that sterile paper dried too fast scent from earlier, the taste of pennies again, faint enough to deny if you were lazy with your tongue. Tango to dispatch, the pilot said, not to me now. We're negative for smoke on Echo 4's south and southwest. Light mirage. We've got patchy static on comms when we cross Echo 4's east timber. Clears on either side. Might be our rig. Copy Tango, dispatch said. Echo 4, status. Negative smoke confirmed aerial, I said. I should have left it there. The training says accuracy first. Interpretation, never. We're experiencing what feels like static in East Line. Tower structure humming. No storm in vicinity. Roger, dispatch said after a small pause that I filled, with the sound of a pencil being set down on a desk 40 miles away. Monitor. Advisory only. I wanted to make the day smaller, something my hands could calibrate. I took the field glasses and set them aside and went to my knees by the finder. It's a ritual to recenter a thing. Loosen the clamp, breathe, let the ring tell you when it's at 0 without looking, tighten, sight a fixed object you can name in your sleep. I chose the notch at Coyote Gate, the old friend at Dio 17 DG. The hairline met it. I put a finger to the degree scale to feel the numbers instead of reading them. The tower's hum answered my finger with a soft vibration. I breathed out, counted 6, and eased my finger away. The hum went with it for a moment, like I had smudged a stain and then settled back into wood. I stood and took the glasses to the east again. The larch had started their courtesy nod at odd intervals now, not on a schedule I could marry to wind or heat pulses. The jay had gone quiet. The sound I'd called static unraveled for a breath into something almost like whispering. Not words, not even the shape of words, just the habit of them. Then the needles took the sound and made it a hush again. The tower hummed along like a tuning fork held against my ribs. I tried to force it into math. If the electric field around the tower were shifting, if dry air and resinous needles were permitting small discharges along edges, I should see corona on sharp points at night. That wouldn't help me now. If a distant line had thrown interference, I'd expect broad-spectrum garbage in the radio, not a tide mark that only rose with the larch line. If heat alone were the culprit, the schedule would be kinder. I made a test of patience. I set a simple countdown, 5 minutes, eyes only, no instruments, to calibrate my own noise. I leaned my forearms on the east rail, let my jaw settle, softened my gaze until the whole edge of the timber stood in my sight at once. The bow came. The hush followed. A wave of hair-raising went up my arms and down them. On the second minute, I felt a press on the right cheek, as if someone had put a cool coin there, though the wind gauge still pointed north-northeast and the catwalk air was uniform. On the fourth, the crank radio clicked in a sequence. 3 ticks close together, pause, 2 ticks, then fell back to its patient drip. On the 5th, the larch forgot to move. Everything held. The tower hum thinned until I wondered if I'd invented it. The mic felt heavier than it should when I picked it up. Echo 4 to dispatch. No smoke. Intermittent static-like phenomena in East Timber. Tower resonance noted. I'm maintaining observation and will log events by time and description. Copy Echo 4, dispatch said. That professional kindness that means both. I hear you and I cannot help. We've got a cell forming far north, but nothing on your sector. Afternoon trend holds. I added the line to the slate and then forced myself to eat because hunger lies to the eyes. Crackers, peanut butter, rations small, water warm. The tower cooled a hair as a wispy cloud brushed the sun. The wind gauge made a tiny reconsideration and went back to its preference as if embarrassed. I pulled the map, the big ridge and drainage sheet with our pencil stirs, and laid it flat to find comfort in known names. The East Larch Line is not on that map. The map writes the forest in blocks and colors that don't care for specific groves. I traced a finger along a creek that never flowed in summer, and placed my nail where the larch stood in my window. The creek and the larch should have met if the paper were right. On my table they met. Out there, the grove sat a little north of where the creek says its bed should be. It's a thing you can chalk to perspective from a tower height, to parallax, to my hunger. I turned the map a few degrees and looked again. The grove slipped back toward the creek bed, and then, when I straightened the sheet, refused the meeting. That was when the firefinder nudged itself. I swear I didn't touch it. The ring gave a tiny, delicate shift you'd miss if you weren't the sort who lives by tiny, delicate shifts. The clamp was tight. The hairline moved half a tick and stopped. I set 2 fingers to the ring and felt nothing but heat and the mild grease of 100 days of careful hands. I closed the slate and wrote one more line on the inside of my head, where the paper can't show anyone later. The map is 14 seconds wrong, the pines take a bow to a note I cannot hear, and the tower prefers a pitch that does not belong to wood. The hour grades slightly, the color a room takes when someone is about to step into it and hasn't yet. I clicked the mic once without speaking, just to feel the button answer me. It did, sure as a habit. The larch did not move. The radio did not tick. The wind, so confident all day, waited like a person behind a closed door with their hand on the knob. By 4, the light took on that dry, pewter edge that makes distance honest and your hands clumsy. The hour wanted a check of everything with a number attached, so I started where I always start when the day has been uncooperative. 0. I loosened the Osborne firefinder clamp and let the ring drift under my fingertips until the black tick met the brass pip with that little magnetic feel it gets when your hand remembers what true feels like. I tightened the clamp. I sighted Coyote Gate at 17 dig, the notch that never lies because it can't. It's cut into stone, its flanks scarred by winters my bones don't want to imagine. The hairline laid clean across the center of the notch. I wrote it on the slate the way we were taught. 1602, gate 17 dig, 0 confirmed. Procedure eases the mind. Mine was a knot. I walked the ring to 079 dig and took the broken snag with the 3 raptor perches, then to 262 digs for the chalk snag and the old burn. Both readings matched the small grease pencil ticks I'd left on the rim months ago. I told myself the day had gone back to school. Then I went back to 193 degree where the gray finger had pretended to be smoke, and lined the hairline on the middle granite blister's right shoulder. The number landed at 194 hanafbars, not 193 dig. A degree and a half isn't much unless you live on lines. I checked my stance, centered my chest over the pedestal, breathed the way my trainer taught me to breathe, when the ring refuses to be tamed. Slow draw, slow let. I did it again. 194 1 froftig. Wind gauge arrow still insisted on north-northeast, even, unwavering, and as if the air had found a track and set its wheels in it. I let it be wrong in the same direction it had been wrong all day. At least that was a constant. Echo 4 to dispatch, I said, voice level. Performing late-day azimuth check. Instruments nominal, noting minor discrepancy on 193 target, now reading 194.5. Will re-verify. Copy Echo 4, dispatch said. No new starts in your zone. We'll log the discrepancy as instrument check. The log slate took the words reluctantly. I don't like to let the slate carry a doubt I can't fix. I set the field glasses and took a look naked through the sight, letting the hairline do the work instead of my want. The blister's right shoulder sat where the hairline told me it sat. The pencil dot I'd erased earlier hovered in memory like a ghost thumbprint. I found myself wanting it back so I could argue with myself. I kept my hands off the glass. Static lifted faintly in the east line of larch, a whisper that wasn't a word, and the tower studs returned their soft, high note like a throat clearing politely. Smell. That clean, paper-dried too fast tang, then gone. I noted it. Direction indeterminate, duration 5 seconds. If I had been reckless with language, I'd have called it anticipatory. I pulled the USGS quad from beneath the map sheet and set it flat, the way you pin a fish you mean to learn from. Landmarks. Gate notch, burn snag ridge, the 3 blister shoulder. I set resection lines with a straight edge, 017 degree from the tower to the gate, 262 dig to the burn, 194 hantifirstars to the blisters. The pencil lines should have met at the tower's center dot, or at least within the circle of error we all pretend is smaller than it is. Instead, they made a tiny triangle that hovered to the north of the tower's printed symbol like a gnat you couldn't swat. Not much, a dozen yards by the scale. A thing you could lose in a boot print, but maps lie slowly, and that slow lie is worse than a bold one. I checked again with back sights, working it backward, set the ring to the recorded numbers, turned my body until the hairline found the landmark. Verify. Gate, burn, blisters. Gate and burn obeyed. The blisters asked me to lean a hair to the right before the shoulder would let the hairline pass. I tried stepping left around the ring in case I was building parallax with my own insistence. The shoulder fought me. I loosened the clamp, spun the ring, re-zeroed. The numbers held their small rebellion. I put my palm on the ring's face to feel for the micro creep I'd sworn by earlier. Nothing but warm metal and the low vibration of the tower's hum, steady as a patient heartbeat. I lifted my hand. The hum followed to the edge of my skin and then snapped back into wood. The wind on my cheek put that cool kin on the right scent again, as if the air had chosen a habit that the vane didn't so much read as endorse. The crank radio ticked. 1, 2, 3, pause, 1, 2. I found my mouth counting the ticks without meaning to. I stopped before my mind made a pattern and the pattern made a statement. Static isn't a code unless you're hungry for it to be. At 16:19, I tried the kind of test that keeps you honest. I called Foxtrot 2, who had worked their way down their slope. A Foxtrot 2, Echo 4. If you have a line on the granite blister's SSW, request your azimuth to middle blister right shoulder. A breath later, their answer, wind-flavored but clear. Echo 4, Foxtrot 2, bearing to your blister's 201 from our location. Your position puts the shoulder around 193 to 194, copy? Copy, copy, I said. I'm reading 194.5 from tower. Confirmed multiple times. We're too low for accurate cross, they said. But your numbers don't sound wild. They were kind. 1.5 degrees is not wild to anyone who doesn't live inside a circle of brass and glass. I thanked them, signed off, and let the ring breathe on its own. I wanted to blame the light. So, I waited 5 minutes and did nothing with my eyes but let them adjust to the pewter. The larch line didn't move. A jay tested a syllable and thought better of speech. When the sun kissed the angle where the apron beyond the blisters begins to slope, the right shoulder threw a small, clean highlight. I caught it with the hairline and read again. 194 start. The highlight faded like a coin turned in a pocket. The wind gauge arrow shivered once, then returned to its preference. The barometer needle eased down the width of a human hair I would have had to prove with a friend's admission. I could feel the moment when procedure wanted to become superstition, and I told it no. Procedure keeps you from inventing a world you can't defend with another person's eyes. I tried one more angle, sound. It's not in the book for lookouts, but I worked a season doing avalanche control where echoes are a kind of tape measure. I took the mic and gave a single press of the transmit without speaking, then released. The tower throws that click back at you from the closest ridge, with a delay I've timed 12 times to amuse and instruct myself. 2 and a bit seconds to the Near East timber, 5 to the burn ridge, a smudge less than 8 to the southern shoulder. I counted under my breath. The east echo arrived where it should. The burn ridge arrived a breath late, half a beat, no more. The south shoulder never answered, silence where a soft double should have lived. I did it again and again. East, present. Burn, late by a hair. South, absent or swallowed. I didn't write that part, not yet. Sound does strange things when the air layer's wrong, when temperature makes density do tricks. But the absent echo pressed a cool coin to my other cheek now, a symmetry I did not ask for. I took the field glasses to the south and let the world settle into a grain. A failing sun draws hard lines on the land. The granite blisters wore their little collars of shadow. The pale apron beyond them showed a faint banding, as if someone had brushed it with a wide, clean broom in parallel strokes. Heat shimmer can write that pattern and then erase it. The banding didn't erase. It slid, left to right, slowly, as if the land beneath the air intended to move and had remembered politeness at the last second. Echo 4, evening check, dispatch said, the day's voice preparing to become the night's. Any change in your earlier reports? Negative smoke? Instruments nominal. Minor azimuth discrepancy persists on 195 sector. Not operationally significant, I said, and felt the little sting somewhere under the word minor. No storm activity. Wind from NNE steady. Copy, she said. We're closing the north desk at 1800. South desk will carry you. If your discrepancy grows, flag for mechanic tomorrow. Will do, I said. Mechanic. The man had hands that smelled like oil and burlap. He believed in things he could measure and the beauty of a calibrated screw. I could already see his face when I told him a ring had moved and then refused to take credit. I went around the catwalk once more, not to see anything new, but to remind my legs what the tower was. Wood, bolts, a duty to stay upright when wind chose otherwise. From the north corner, I looked back through my own windows and saw myself reflected faint in the south pane. A figure at a ring, a small animal on a platform. The reflection's hairline looked true on the gate notch. In the same pane, overlaid, the hairline on the blisters was off by the same unhappy degree. I don't know why it comforted me that even my ghost couldn't reconcile them. Back inside, I set my palm on the firefinder once more, a quiet apology to the tool for asking it to carry what wasn't its fault. The metal was warmer than the room by a whisper. The hum through the pedestal had shifted a half shade lower, almost a new note. I breathed with it for a count of 10. When I lifted my hand, for a second the hum seemed to stay with the skin instead of the steel, like a thread had tied me to the ring. It let go. I wrote on the slate what I was willing to show another pair of eyes. 1647 to 1712. Azimuth to blisters reads 194.5 deers. Other checks nominal. Wind steady, NNE, odor metallic, paper. Transient, no smoke. Then, because the day had earned it, I added a line that would look harmless in a report and meant something only to me. Echo south absent. It would pass a glance as a note about radio reception. If anyone asked, I could tell the truth with the least number of words. I pressed a button. The sooth did not reply. The tower paused in that way wood has, the tiny stillness between two creaks that gives the impression of a thought deciding. The larch line did not bow. The wind did not learn a new direction. The barometer needle settled to where it had intended all along. Evening was going to come, whether I put a name to any of it or not. I set the Osborne to 0 and left it there, a small truce. I put the field glasses where they live, nose down. I turned the crank radio's handle once out of habit and listened to its private hum complete a circle on itself, slow and satisfied. I did not turn it on. I let the tower hold the last note of the day without me adding one more sound to it. Evening arrived like someone tightening the lead on a jar. The dry brightness found its boundary. The shadows thickened at the base of every tree, and the timber lowered its voice. The hour promised a trade, day's convective mess for night's clean downslope. You come to count on that exchange the way you count on railings to stay where they are. I wrote the time, 1851, then stood on the north catwalk and waited for the first honest touch of katabatic flow. The wind gauge thanked me by staying where it had lived all day. North, northeast, steady. A metronome. Even while the flats down valley purpled and the hawks folded their plans, the vane refused the downslope like a man who will not leave a chair he has warmed. I stepped back inside and felt for the air with my face. The right cheek cooled first again. I put that in the margin and underlined it, not because the fact had changed, but because the time had. Night teaches a different class of wrong. I cleared the Osborne to 0 and let the ring rest. The fire risk board in the corner, arrow stuck at very high. Watch me pretend the word very had ever meant anything practical. I drank water that tasted like pine and old tin and opened the window above the south sill. Heat slipped out in a grateful sheet. I set the field glasses in the sill's notch and let my eye learn the ridge shapes for night work. The middle blister's profile, the apron's pale run, the saddle between our tower and Coyote Gate that makes a dark smile at dusk. At 1914, dispatch passed the desk to the night voice, the one who had the same habits but different footsteps. Echo 4, South Desk online. Any evening anomalies to note? Negative fires, I said. Wind persistent NNE despite dusk. Minor azimuth discrepancy persists on 195 sector. No storm, no lightning reported. Copy, she said. We're running a lightning hold north past midnight. You'll have one aircraft on call if needed. Give the night thermals an hour to settle your picture. I thanked her and put the radio down. The crank radio had crept closer on the shelf. I don't move it without noticing, but there it was, a palm width farther toward the south pane, as if I'd set it there while thinking about something else. I rolled it back to its scuffed circle on the wood and left it. The first star shouldered through twilight above the east line, then a second. I felt for Polaris the way you do when you want to insult your own instruments with a star you trust. I found the Big Dipper low and flat, ran the two bowl stars forward in my mind and in the sky, and set my body by that calm point over the north window. In the Osborne, 0 felt true again, like resetting your jaw after grinding it too long. I wrote a small Polaris check, okay. The note was more for my bones than a mechanic. I went down the ladder to ground to feel the air because the catwalk sometimes lies about texture. The duff exhaled warmed sap. A moth stuttered around the lantern's caged bulb, and then chose the dark like a smart thing. I walked the tower base clockwise and let my hand graze the uprights. The hum I had lived with all afternoon was quieter but tighter, like a line tuned higher with the same amount of pull. Along the north footing, the dirt felt a degree cooler than the south. I pressed the back of my wrist to the concrete pier to learn what the day had stored. It still gave heat back. That's ordinary. A little ways out, where a ring of bare mineral keeps brush honest, the ground read cooler than the air above it. Another ordinary night fact. What was not ordinary was the band of air at my knee that traveled from east to west when I stopped to listen. I held still long enough to be sure, then longer to be rude. The band flowed like water in a shallow dish being slid across a table. No sound, no texture, no smell. I stepped forward and the band stepped through me and did not care. Back up top, the timber had become a silhouette library. The larch line stood black and fine, every twig drawn with a stubborn pen. They did not bow. I tuned the radio to CH3 and gave a 10-minute check, then set the mic aside and tested the tower's echo again with a thumb click. East returned at the same 2 seconds and change. The Burn Ridge answered late by half a beat. The south shoulder did not answer at all. It should have been louder at night. Night returns sound like a polite host, clear, punctual. The absence put a pin just under the skin beside the collarbone, the place where a nurse checks your pulse when she wants the truth of you without asking. I fed myself a line of tasks to keep doubt from writing its own orders. Start a star log for a quarter hour. Note the first owl call with time. Walk the Osborne to each quadrant and sit on it for a full minute without interpretation, just to let the ring rehearse being a circle. In the middle of the first minute on 193 because the night intends the places you dread, the gray finger that had teased me in day returned, a thing you only see if you watch a long time and choose not to blink. It rose on the apron's far side, faint, and then sharpened just enough to give itself a waist. If smoke had memory, it would look like that. Wind from the north-northeast should have pressed it eastward. It deepened, wavered toward the ridge, and then stood. South desk, echo 4, I said, keeping my voice and my hands clean. I have intermittent column on earlier bearing 194 to 195. Night view weak but persistent. Request cross from any station with southern angle. Copy echo 4, she said after a longer pause than the day would have allowed. We can raise Bravo 1 on the West Road in 20. No aircraft until morning, unless you upgrade. Not upgrading, I said, because you don't order a night ship into a maybe. Holding observation. The crank radio ticked 3-2 again like it had learned numbers no one taught it. I set my palm over it and felt a faint warmth that did not belong to a device with its switch off. I lifted my hand and the warmth stayed where the radio sat, not where I'd been. The taste in my mouth, that penny's taste, arrived and left with a single breath. I tried a different test, one taught by a winter partner who wanted proofs. Star occultation against a profile. If a column lives, it will swallow a star and return it late. I waited. The night juggled a few bright points until one approached the place where the column leaned. The star climbed the slope of the ridge like a tiny animal and stepped into the column. For 2 heartbeats it dulled, as if seen through frosted glass. 11 seconds later than sky math allowed, it came out on the other side and blinked hard as if glad to be a point again. I marked the time and felt foolish for feeling proud of a trick that would mean little to anyone who wasn't here. I had not noticed the smell arrive until I wrote that. It wasn't penny tongue or paper. It was a clean, wet rock smell with no wet to serve it. Summer stores scents and dust. You can kick a day's worth of memory into the air with a boot. No boot had kicked. The smell came from the east line, crossed the tower, and went south. I leaned into it without moving. The wind gauge held its silly arrow. Night's downslope never put its hand on my back. The band at my knees turned west to east now, like someone had reversed a fan I couldn't hear. A faint light to the southwest. No, not light. A matter of dark against darker, shaped like a thumbnail pressed into clay. I made the mistake of wanting it to be headlights on a distant road you only see on certain nights. I lifted the glasses and found no road, no car. The notch of dark slid along the base of the blisters in time with the columns thick and thin, then lay down and became part of nothing. Radio. A single carrier burst on CH3 with no voice. Another 2 seconds later, I grabbed the mic and gave my call sign. Silence. The carrier came again like someone half a ridge away had pressed a transmit button absent-mindedly while looking for something in a pack. I considered a prank and put it away. No one whose pay grade matched mine would waste a prank on me this far from beer. I put the map back on the table and laid a metal ruler along the creek line beneath the east larch. The scale said the grove should meet the water at a bend that in daylight smiled right. In the window the grove sat north and the bend sat south, and they wouldn't forgive each other. I rotated the map 10 degrees and the disagreement went away. I squared the sheet and it returned. I made another little triangle with pencil lines that should have met. The triangle sat stubborn as something chosen. The Osborne's ring gave its polite nudge, the kind of slip a mechanic will not find in the morning because you need a particular night to feel it. I checked the clamp, tight. I splayed my fingers around the site, like I could calm a horse that wasn't there. The tower's hum shifted back up a half shade, wooden breath catching and releasing. The larch in the east finally bowed, once, a deep nod from the center out, like a circle closing. Immediately after, the crank radio's tick died. For a moment the tower felt empty, an empty you recognize from a room just after a person leaves. I found myself saying, "All right," not into the mic, not to anyone. Bravo 1 came up, breathless from their bad road. "Echo 4, we're west of your sector. We can't see your apron, ridge blocks. If you can give us a high contrast landmark, we'll set for a night cross-check." I looked, measured, did the little ritual of not hurrying. "Reference granite triple south-southwest," I said. "From your approach, the leftmost will line with a snag that forks at 10 feet. If you have that, the column sits right shoulder of middle." "Copy," they said. "Give us 6 minutes." 6 minutes became 8. The column was kinder in night than day. It thickened and thinned and never asked me to lie to call it. I refrained anyway. An owl called once from the drainage below, and then decided the call should not be repeated. The wind gauge arrow shivered, and for the first time slid a finger-width west. I waited for the tower to feel it. Nothing touched my face. Bravo 1 again. "Echo 4, we've got your triple. Negative column. Air over your apron reads clean. We do have localized cold pooling at our knees. That's odd for this slope." "Copy," I said, and wrote their cold pooling next to my own knee band. The two notes made a line I did not like. "Hold there 10. If any odor, call it." We held together, two small, tired crews joined by a line that could break by accident. They had no smell. I did. The wet rock returned and left. The column softened to a suggestion, and then refused even that. When I reached for the pencil dot I hadn't restored, my thumb tapped the glass and left a clean print in the pane. The tower hummed in sympathy and let the note fall back into wood. "Echo 4, south desk," the night voice said, soft enough to belong to the room. "We've got a marine push flirting far west. No chance it reaches you. If your anomaly holds until 22, we can request a late overflight from North Base. No promises. Your call." "You're in negative overflight," I said, and the decision tasted like metal. "I'll carry it. If it builds, I'll upgrade." I wrote the hour down to keep it from running. I ate a piece of bread gone hard and put the heel back in its bag. When I looked up, the east larch stood so still I thought for a second they'd been cut from paper and glued to the world. Then one twig at the extreme left shook as if a small animal had stepped there and regretted it. I put the Osborne to 0 and kept it there, the little truce I make when I don't trust myself to read. I set the field glasses down nose first and closed one window to hear the tower better. The hum thinned, thickened, matched my breathing, refused it. Somewhere south, where an echo should have lived, the night held a space the exact shape of a reply that wouldn't come. It stayed that way until the first cool of true night took the catwalk boards and made the old pine breathe out one last day's worth of warmth. By 2100, the tower had cooled enough that the wood quit its day-long sighing. Night should have simplified the air. Downslope should have laced itself around the legs of the tower and whispered the old rules. I put the aneroid barometer where I could see it without moving my head. The brass-lipped face with its dollhouse numerals, the little black needle that has no business with drama. I rapped the glass once with a fingernail to settle it, the way I was taught. The needle jumped a hair and then came to rest at 2978. It had been drifting down, fine for a hot day rimmed with distant cells and a late marine push 100 miles away. But a night without thunder, a sky unwrinkled by anvils, should give me a slow ease or a stall. I made the note on the slate, 2103, pressure, 29.78 inchi, falling slowly. I stood still long enough to feel the air's texture, then stepped to the north window with the field glasses. The stars had crisped. You could count the brighter mess of the Milky Way, as if someone had taken a broom to it. I checked Polaris against the Osborne, habit now, an apology, and a dare. 0 said honest to that small, patient light. I tried the south again for the column out of stubbornness, more than expectation. The apron wore its soft night gray. Nothing moved that a story would keep. Good. My job favors boredom. Under the windowsill, the crank radio had found its way a finger's width toward the south pane again. I was about to blame my own hand when the barometer needle climbed. Just a hair, as if it had remembered that falling without cause was impolite, and then fell past its original mark. 29.76. I tapped the glass the way a person corrects themselves in public, gentle so no one sees. The needle shivered and, defiant, slid lower another tiny notch. I wrote it down and underlined falling. The underlining did nothing for the weather. South desk, Echo 4, I said on CH3, voice even. Note pressure drop here continues past evening stabilization. No storm on scan. Echo 4, we've got clean radar in a 2-county radius, she said, paper dry. Weak onshore front stalling west. Models hold it there. Your numbers are odd, not alarming. Odd is our pasture. I logged it that way and shut my mouth. The tower rewarded me with a hum underfoot shaded lower than it had been at dusk. I put my palm to the pedestal, then lifted it away. The note followed to the heel and then snapped back, polite as ever. I marked the wind gauge out of habit, still north-northeast, steady, and tried to stop myself from underlining that too. At 21:22, I ran a check on echoes again with the little click of the mic. East timber, 2 and a breath. Burn ridge, late by a half syllable. South shoulder, nothing. I did it 3 more times and counted with the same rhythm. You can teach your mouth to keep time better than any watch if you live alone enough hours. On the 4th test, the east echo returned a hair early, so slight you'd call it nerves if a person did it. I wrote it as a question. East echo, early, wind still NNE. The pencil looked uncertain on the slate. I took the aneroid down from its nail. The brass has calibration screws you aren't supposed to love, and set it on the table to put the needle at eye level. With the face horizontal, the needle should sit where it sat on the wall if the mechanics are clean. It didn't. It read higher by a hair, tiny but there. I turned it upright, back to lower. I laid it flat on its back again, gave the glass a tap, and watched it climb. Upright, fell. Not temperature. The tower was one room, one slow breath. I thought of temperature stratification and laughed into my teeth, laughable. The difference between my elbows and my boots would not revise air's weight. I set the barometer on the Osborne, metal upon metal, bad habit but deliberate, and watched the needle decide. It went lower another tick, the way a person answers the friend they like better. I took it off the ring and set it on the soft map case, then on the windowsill, then on the bare wood. The readings were cousins, not siblings. I put my thumb gently on the glass and felt the room in my skin, the hum telegraphing up bone. When I pulled the thumb away, the needle flicked. I did not write that down. Mechanics hate hauntings. Radio. One small burst, then a second, like the earlier unvoiced taps. Echo 4 to Bravo 1, I said, peering through the south. Status on your west road? Echo 4, we're back at the junction, they said, voice tired and warmer with dust. No column on any southern face. Cooler air pocket around our knees still present, moving west to east. No odor. Copy, I said, and we left each other alone. The larch to the east, black against the star wash, gave a single deep bow and then notched themselves upright as if guided there. The bow pulled the tower's hum a shade higher and then released it. Smell. Wet rock again, faint, a mouthful that arrived like the first line of a letter and then tore itself in half. I needed proof that could travel without my skin. I took the log slate and made a tight column on the right edge. 2131 borrow 2975, 2132 tap glass 2976 falls to 29. 75 2134 laid flat on map 2977, 2136 upright on sill 2974, 2138 upright on Osborne 2973. Then smaller, as if for my own eyes only. No storm, no gradient. The knee height band, the one from earlier that had traveled east to west like a dish sliding, returned and reversed itself mid-room without draft, without sound. I took a knee by the south window and held the back of my hand as a crude anemometer. The band passed me from west to east and then, after a pause counted to 8, returned east to west. I held still and thought of water finding small grades in a basin you can't see. At 21:44, the crank radio hummed without being wound, a sound I'd have dismissed if I wanted to keep my day. I looked at the switch, still off. I brought my ear close. The hum stopped. I eased back. It returned. The sound lived in the wood shelf, or in whatever the shelf had decided to host. I put the radio on the map for a test. The hum diminished, then resumed like it had found the ring's absence wanting and returned to its shelf. Echo 4, South Desk, the night voice said. Advisory from the north. A brief, localized static event on their repeater at 27 past. Cleared now. No other reports. You're quiet? Quiet, I said, and left the rest unsaid. Quiet the way a hallway is quiet when you know a door you cannot see has been opened. Pressure falling. No cause visible. Logging. Copy, she said. We'll note it. I went below again with a flashlight held against my thigh to keep the beam off the timber. The ground had that night crisp you can't fake. I held my breath and listened for the soft hiss of beetles at work, for a vole, for the ordinary. The ordinary refused me. A single moth struck my shoulder and changed its mind. At the North Pier, the air felt cooler by a degree. At the south, it gave heat back like a mouth exhaling. I stretched the back of my hand over the bare mineral ring and found the knee band again, now marching toward the tower from the east, through the legs and out the west like a polite procession. Steady cadence, no sound. Back inside, I took the Osborne and set a slow sweep, letting the hairline crawl across each dark ridge to remind myself that land had not left. At 22:03 on the south, the hairline crossed the right shoulder of the middle blister, and I read 194 hafter again. I wrote it and did not argue with it. Then I tried a little mischief for which I would apologize in the morning. I set the ring to 193 first, and then moved my body until the shoulder met the hairline. It refused the meeting by the same unhappy degree. I said, all right, again, quiet like a truce. The barometer needle kissed 29.72. I watched it for a full minute, the way you watch a stove, when you think you've turned it off but don't trust your hand. It crept lower while the sky above remained an accountant's ledger of clear. The smell returned, now metallic paper, as if the tower had received a package and signed for it. I tried one last honest test. A weight. I hung the plumb bob we keep for tower checks from a nail over the Osborne's center mark. The bob should hang through the center crosshair if the tower is plumb enough for government work. It did. The tower didn't lean. Something else did. I set the bob swinging gently to see if the hum would catch its frequency. The swing died without ever meeting the tower's note. The note changed anyway, by a hair, then returned. I wrote the words no coupling and drew a line under them, as if underlines could persuade wood to behave. Echo 4, Bravo 1 broke in, softer now that the night had taken some of their bravado. For your log, our analog barometer's steady at 29.83. That's a little high for us, but holding. We're lower than you, so allow for that. No drop. Copy, I said, and the line I drew next to their number on my slate was longer than it needed to be. If their glass held and mine fell, either the sky had learned to step around them and sit on me, or my instrument had joined the day's small rebellions. I rapped the glass one more time, gentle but not apologetic. The needle sank a final hair to 29.71 and held. I put my eye to the south again in case the column chose that moment to teach me humility. No column, but the apron wore that faint banding like brush strokes, left to right movement, steady as a machine. Above it, one star stepped into the area where the banding lay and lost a little of its insistence, then came through a second later with more pride than made sense. I did not mark that. I marked my pulse and found it too quick for a night with no visible work. The wind gauge, which had kept faith with wrongness all day, shivered and turned 2 finger widths west, the first change that felt like an honest one. I waited for my cheek to learn the same newness. It did not. The right cooled first, then the left, and then both at once. The sensation you get when a door opens behind you, even if the room says it has no door. I closed one window to make the room smaller and wrote 2231, borrow 2971, wind vane W by NNE shift, face reports unchanged. Knee band persists, echo south absent. Then I set the pencil down and felt the quiet no. I had nothing else to call a fact. The tower hummed its small, steady note. The larch stood as if they had agreed to a kind of stillness. The barometer's needle, which does not have a mind, behaved like one that had chosen to visit and leave in small, deliberate steps. I kept my body still the way a field hand does when a wire he didn't know was hot sings somewhere close. If the night wanted a name from me, it would not get one. It would get lines, numbers, bearings, a story told without the part where you turn a shadow into a person. I set the Osborne to 0, an act of faith. I touched the brass, and for a second the hum in the steel matched the hum in my sons. We both held, then let the note go. At 2300, the tower had settled into the kind of quiet that makes you think of work you've avoided. The barometer sat stubborn at 29. 71, my pencil line beneath it a little darker from checking too often. The wind gauge had edged a hair toward west and then thought better of growth. My face refused to register the change. I clicked the mic once and timed the echoes. East prompt, burn ridge late by a half syllable, south shoulder absent, and wrote the small arithmetic of that absence in the margin, as if numbers could keep me company. Below the tower, the firebreak was a pale belt cinched around the little knoll. 2 blade widths of pushed mineral, with the duff scoured back to leave a no-man's land. I had raked its inside edge at noon, a ring of neat broom marks that read like writing if you wanted it to. The job teaches you to make surfaces that show when a thing crosses. Sometime near midnight, I realized I had been glancing down at that belt between other tasks, checking it the way a person checks a door lock twice without admitting why. The ring should have been an honest blank. I ran one last sweep across the south with the Osborne, hairline across the right shoulder of the middle blister at the now familiar 194 honey soul, and forced myself to look without wanting the column. No column. The apron carried its faint, left-to-right banding like a habit it was done explaining. I put the finder at 0, set the field glass's nose down, and told myself I was going down to feel the air, nothing more. There is a line in the training about leaving the tower in darkness. You don't unless fire or life makes the argument for you. I wrote the time, 23:07, and the words perimeter check, night, and left the slate exactly where I could see it when I came back, as if that would guarantee coming back. The ladder creaked the way old ladders do when a body tells them its weight. I kept the flashlight dark. The moon had not yet shouldered up, but the stars carried enough light to draw edges. At ground level, the night smelled faintly of warm sap and granite. A moth ticked my shoulder and vanished. I crouched at the inner edge of the firebreak and put 2 fingers to the mineral where I knew my midday rake lines should be. The grooves were there, straight and parallel, except for one place where they lost themselves under a smear. At first, I told myself a deer had stepped wrong at twilight. My light hand found the switch by habit, and I tapped the flashlight on for one breath, low and caged against my thigh so as not to paint the trees. 3 marks sat where the smooth mineral should have held nothing, not hooves, not boot. Each was an oval with a blunt foredge, the fine dust impressed in a way that spoke of a thing that weighs and doesn't. Between the ovals lay a narrow drag like the wake of a toe or a stick, except it had no stray scratch lines, no grit throw. The 3 marks crossed the firebreak as if on a ruler, east to west, straight as a survey line. Then, where my noon rake met the outer duff, the marks continued into needles and vanished not 5 feet in, though dust should have clung to whatever made them and written a longer sentence. I switched the light off and let the night heal. You can invent shapes with light at the wrong hour. I lay my palm flat where the foremost mark had pushed and felt a coolness that didn't belong. The knee-height band I'd tracked all evening passed over my wrist, west to east, then reversed without the courtesy of a pause, as if the night had given itself permission to change its mind. I stood and listened for the small hurry of an animal that had made those signs. The timber refused even the fiction of a retreating body. Procedure claimed the next 5 minutes, so I would not give them to superstition. I paced 12 steps west along the inner edge of the break, counting slow and then back. I traced the entire ring, 234 steps, fingers hovering an inch above the mineral to feel for the slight fall-off that a print leaves even when eyes are lazy. At the north side, a ground spider had laid a single thread across the mineral, a high wire catching starlight, unbroken. Nothing tall had passed here. At the east side, a single track of a vole pausing, then committing to the brush. No other disturbance until I returned to the 3 ovals where I started. They were alone. I wrote the shapes into my head with the exactness you save for a thing you know you'll be asked about later and have to answer without decoration. Length the span between index finger and thumb when spread. Width 2 fingers. Depth shallow. Rim crisp, like weight applied clean and bored with friction. The rule against leaving the tower tugged at me. The stronger tug was the one that comes when your instruments tell you one thing and the ground tells you another. I stepped across the firebreak exactly where the tracks did, and I felt something like a cool sheet lift and resettle, the sense you get in a doorway when a house breathes. 2 steps into the needles, I stopped and counted to 8, to see if sound would announce my trespass. Nothing answered. I aimed myself to where a body would have to go if it were walking east to west in a straight faith. And I found nothing further. No crushed duff, no scraped bark, no glow of disturbed dust when I breathed on the ground. When I stepped back across the break, I looked at my own prints where mineral gives up your weight without mercy. Mine showed as blunt boot ovals with the heel scalloped the way my right boot likes to scallop. They took the rake lines and pulled them into little fans. The other 3 hadn't fanned anything. They'd gone down and touched without dragging grit. From the base of the tower, I thumb-clicked the mic for the echo test. East presented. Burn Ridge lingered. South Shoulder kept its silence like a secret it was tired of keeping. Back up top I wrote, 2322, 3 impressions crossing inner break EW, shape oval, blunt, no fan, no follow-on in duff, knee band reversal concurrent. The pencil scratched louder than I meant it to. The room absorbed the sound and made it feel like speech. I put the field glasses to the east line out of habit and watched the larch. They had been church still for an hour. As I watched, a ripple ran the center 3 canopies in a way I'd call wind if wind had honored us. The ripple had the look of a hand pressing down and lifting up on green cloth. A soft sound, the kind needles make when they speak to one another, lifted and faded with that press. The crank radio on the shelf ticked once, then matched the larch with a single gentler tick, as if in sympathy. Echo 4 to south desk, I said, keeping my voice at the useful level register that makes people on the other end write without interrupting. No smoke. Note, at 23:15 to 23:20, 3 discrete ground impressions crossed interior side of tower firebreak E to W. Not hoof, not boot, shallow crisp rim, no continued sign into duff. Concurrent knee-level airband reverse direction twice. Holding observation, will recheck at 0 hour. Silence, then her voice with its steady pencil. Echo 4, logged. Any need for ground assist? Negative, I said, because the one thing worse than standing next to something you can't name is asking someone else to stand there with you. I'll resweep in 30. Copy, she said. Advise any change. Yet I walked the Osborne ring to 1D3 degrees again and let my eyes sit at the site for a full minute until the hairline and the blister stopped shimmering into each other. The apron beyond wore its left to right bands like a conveyor that had been set at the lowest setting and forgotten. A star eased toward the leftmost band, dulled a hair, and then walked out a second late. I told myself optical trick and left it at that. The barometer needle shrugged itself lower to 29. 70, as if to remind me whose business it was to move without explanation. The part of me that loves instruments wanted to test those impressions with pressure, measure the pounds per square inch implied by the rim and depth. The part of me that has spent nights alone in timber knew better than to assign weight to something that hadn't felt the need to drag grit. I took the plumb bow and hung it over the Osborne center for the ritual of normalcy. It found true and held. While it swung down to stillness, I pressed the transmit without speaking. The tower's close echoes behaved, then the farther one lingered, then the south refused. An equation solved the same wrong way 3 times. At 23:49, I went down again with a scrap of cardstock and a pencil to lift a print the way you lift an eraser crumb. Gentle, ashamed. It was too dry for any powder to cling. I knew that before I knelt. I traced the outline by feel anyway, kidnapping the shape into the card. When I stood, the knee band passed through me east to west and didn't come back. I closed my hand on the card, climbed with my fist clenched like a child hiding something, and set the tracing on the table. In tower light, the ovals I had drawn looked like nothing so much as 3 careful mistakes. I labeled them E, mid, W, the way we label unnamed things to bargain with their dignity. On the slate I added, ZO3, return to base. Impressions unchanged, no new sign around perimeter, inner rake lines intact elsewhere. Note, 3 ovals did not fan rake grooves. Echo south absent, borrow 2970. Then, smaller, track stop at line that shows nothing. It passed as a note about the break if anyone chose to read it that way. The larch bowed once more, not the shallow courtesy of afternoon, but a deeper agreement. center first and working outward until the two end trees considered and then joined. No wind pressed my face. The gauge arrow made a tiny, embarrassed half step and recovered its composure. The crank radio's hum returned to itself like a small animal settling in, and the tower's hum climbed a shade as if it had been tuned to a pitch I hadn't asked for. I set the Osborne to 0 out of habit and apology, touched the brass, and felt that thread of vibration pick up my bones for a heartbeat, and put them back down where it had found them. The night, which had been patient all day about not answering, did not adopt a new habit because I had seen 3 precise wrongs in dust. It stayed what it was: clear, dry, a set of ridges that knew their own names and refused to share them. I made the room smaller by closing one window and left the other open to listen. Somewhere south, in the place where a reply should live, the shape of that reply remained, a vacancy that had the weight of a presence if you refused to grant it that courtesy. I washed the dust from my fingers with a cap of water and wiped them dry on the leg of my pants. The water left a wet rock smell that belonged to another part of the day. It sat in the air for a minute, then was gone, the way a person takes their hat from a peg and you don't hear the door. I wrote the last line of the hour: tower secure, instruments normal by their own definition, ground sign anomalous, contained, monitoring. The pencil didn't argue, the slate kept its peace. The map lay clean, the creek line meeting the grove on paper if not in the window. I watched the fire break until stars slid on, until the dust forgot the ovals I'd lifted with my card and decided to be mineral again. Just after midnight, the tower felt like a room that had heard a rumor and decided to keep it. The clock face, yellowed and honest, put the minute hand on 12 and then looked away. The barometer's black needle held at 29. 70, like it was pretending steadiness, the way a person holds still when they want you to stop asking questions. The wind vane, faithful to its oddness, stayed north-northeast with that patient, machine sort of certainty. Down in the timber, the small night went on. Cricket scrapes, a moth's thrum, the once-an-hour owl that refused to make a pattern. I should have been content to count the hours. Instead, I found myself listening for absence. Not silence. Silence has a texture, but the exact shape of a missing sound. I thumb-clicked the mic for the echo check and counted under my breath. East returned clean. Burn Ridge late by its half syllable. South shoulder refused. I set the Osborne to 0 as a courtesy to my hands and walked one slow circle on the catwalk, elbows tucked, field glasses idle at my chest. Halfway along the east side, the air got thinner without cooling, the way a room feels just after a door closes somewhere you can't see. The needle speech softened until the larch line was only picture, not sound. I took 2 more steps and the tower's faint hum died out under my feet as if someone had lifted it and set it aside. 1 step farther and the hum returned. The needle spoke again and the ordinary night climbed back into its chair. I backed into the quiet and felt it strip the small noises away in a clean run. Moth, gone. Cricket, gone. Tower, gone. My own breath sounded like it belonged to someone else. The place where sound should have lived was not dead. It was organized, like a library after closing. I took a shallow step out. The world snapped back to itself. No drama, just a ledger line turning into a note again. I stood with 1 boot in the quiet and 1 boot out and tried to measure with my skin. The right cheek cooled first still. The wind vane still read north-northeast and did not care about my horses. At knee height, the band I'd been courting all night moved east to west with a steady, unhurried patience. In the quiet, the band wasn't a draft. It was a direction you could have drawn with a pencil. When it passed my shin, I felt a softened pressure, like the weight of a rolled map held against the leg. I let it go through me without turning. After 4 heartbeats, it reversed and went back the way it came. I want numbers for things. I put the crank radio on the sill and didn't turn it on. Still off, still pretending to nap. I slid it 2 inches to the left, into the quiet, and the shelf quit humming. I slid it back to the right, out of the quiet, and the faint, lazy coil hiss came back. I did it 3 times, slow, watching the place where wood stops being wood and starts being a host. I wrote the time on the slate and then caught myself before I wrote anything that would make a mechanic frown at me in the morning. I was the only thing in reach that could be a metronome. I set my hand flat on the catwalk rail and then tapped the rail with a knuckle in a steady count. 1, 2, 3. In the quiet, the tap died on the wood. Out of it, the tower answered with a small, proper thock and sent that sound into the legs the way it should. I walked the catwalk slowly, keeping the tap, and listening for where the thock disappeared. On the east side, the corridor ran true along the timberline, 3 paces wide, maybe 4, centered on a bearing just off due east-west. I held it in the Osborne and read 090 for the rail, 092 digs for the center of the quiet where my knuckle lost its thock. A narrow thing, honest as a string pulled taut across the room. The thought that came next was not kind to training. I went down the ladder with the flashlight dark and stepped to the inner edge of the fire break, the pale ring where my 3 wrong ovals had crossed. The corridor was there too, running east-west like a drawn line you could tug. I tapped the shovel blade hanging on its nail, a careful, patient tap, and the sound went away when I moved the shovel into the line, then returned when I pulled it back. On the mineral itself, if I rubbed a boot sole, grit spoke everywhere except in that stripe. There, friction made less noise than it ought, like the ground had been dusted with a felt you couldn't see. I went back up before I gave myself reason to argue with the rule about leaving the tower. The slate took what I could afford to write. Narrow zone of damped sound trending EW at tower level. Width 3-4 paces. Moves? On that question my hand wanted to write yes. The band at my knee had been steady east-west all evening, but the quiet had a slow drift north, like a tide that didn't care about the map. I stood in the southeast corner of the catwalk and waited for the corridor to reach it. When it did, the tower hum died, the larch's whisper became picture again, and the crank radio went to sleep without the dignity of an off switch. I looked at the Osborne, at the ring tuned to 0, and felt the brass like a pulse under my hand. The hum wasn't in the ring, it was in what the ring had been made to believe, and for a moment my bones matched it in that unpleasant way we had developed. The note in the tower, and the note in me choosing a truce. I tried the star trick once more, because it does not ask anyone to take my word for what a room feels like. I sighted a bright point low in the east and waited for it to climb into the corridor. When it did, it dulled by a hair and lagged. A breath, not a second. Less dramatic than before, but the kind of thing an eye that spent a life on scales will keep, even if it won't argue. I marked the time and made no promise to anyone else's eyes. Dispatch's night voice came with the small courtesy that belongs to late hours. Echo 4, anything to report at 0? Negative fires, I said. Localized anomalies persist, trending east-west, instruments normal by their own definitions. I could hear the pencil pause. If you have any traffic on a late overflight, no need to route them here, I added, because I could not say what I wanted anyone to see. Copy, she said. We'll keep you clear. At Wood 21, the corridor slid farther north. On the north catwalk, the quiet ate the creek's little night talk and gave me back bare shape. I placed my palm on the Osborne pedestal and felt nothing in the steel. I lifted it. The hum stayed in the wood where I wasn't. I pressed the transmit key 1 click and listened for the east echo. It arrived too clean, like a sound delivered by hand. The burn ridge was late again by that half syllable. The south shoulder did not answer, but in the quiet the absence changed shape. From missing to excluded, like a thing knocked on a door and the door decided to remain a wall. I wanted bearings. I sighted the edges of the corridor as if they were ridge lines. On the east, the southern edge read 89 dig, the northern 94 dig. On the west, the southern edge read datter, the northern 4 dig. The thing had width even to the Osborne. That felt like mercy. The center line ran a breath north of true. I put those numbers on the slate and the tower's day-long rumor of wrong azimuths looked a shade less lonely. My 3-track line across the firebreak ran east-west. The knee band had been doing the same dance all night. The echo that refused me lived south. The barometer leaned down. Even a superstition knows better than to call that coincidence. I did not call it anything the radio could carry. The wind vane made a quarter turn toward west, as if it had finally overheard what my cheek had been telling me. The catwalk air did not congratulate it. Right cheek cooled first, then left, then neither. The smell that had traded between wet rock and pennies drifted up, paper clean, then left the way a careful guest leaves a room. I took up the map and laid a straight edge along the corridor's edges, extended them past our little hill. On paper, the band ran straight through the apron, behind the granite blisters, and then on toward a low saddle I knew from winter avalanche work, a place where snow runs hesitate and make their bargains. On the same straight edge, the creek under the east larch missed its printed bed by that same dozen yards that had been making me draw little triangles all day. I turned the map 6 degrees, and the creek forgave the larch and met it. When I squared the sheet, they quarreled again. I kept my hands still and let the lines be wrong together without meddling. At 0:47, the corridor touched the tower dead on. I knew because the hum vanished all at once, and the catwalk lost its friendly creak. And a moth that had been insisting on my lantern's cage hit the mesh with no sound at all, as if its wings were moving by sight only. I set my palm flat on the ring without thinking. Nothing answered me from steel or wood. The strangest quiet of the night. The barometer's needle, which had pretended to be steady, slid down another hair to 29.69 while the sky over us stayed perfect and the horizon promised no weather. I tapped the glass and the needle twitched, as if that had been the permission it needed to be honest. There's a test an old lookout taught me for nights when the mind starts to decorate sound. He'd drop a washer from the same height onto the same place on the catwalk and listen for the note it made traveling the tower. Not loud, not clever, just a little bell of a ring that finds every screw thread in your home. I found a washer in the repair tin and held it at shoulder height over the same board I always use. In the corridor, the washer's ring died against the board before it could become itself. Out of the corridor, it found its little song and ran it clean down the legs. I did it twice and then put the washer back. That was enough proof for a man who has to stay the rest of the night. Echo 4, South Desk check, came the radio, soft to match the hour. Status. Green, I said. No smoke. Anomalies stable, holding. Copy, she said. Advise if you need company. I looked at the ladder and pictured another pair of boots on it. The thought made the room feel smaller in the wrong way. Negative, I said, and left the mic where it belonged. At 01:03, the corridor lifted off the catwalk, with all the ceremony of a page being turned and moved on. A little north of me now, threading the timber in a line the larch recognized. They bowed, deeper at the center, then rose. The tower hum returned thin and felt relieved to have it yob again. The crank radio ticked once and then settled like a beast in straw. The south shoulder remained the shape of a reply that refused to exist. I wrote 105 corridor north of tower, edges at 093, 273, width constant, and then shut the slate because the pencil had learned to look tired. I stood with my hands on the Osborne, not pressing, just letting their weight tell me if the ring wanted to speak. It didn't. The night gave me back all the small, ordinary things it had held. A zipper of crickets, a single owl deciding to keep its call to itself, resin in warm knots cooling down. The corridor moved on toward the saddle, as if it had an appointment there. The larch kept their place, the creek argued with the map, the barometer argued with the sky. I let the arguments have the room and did the one thing my job still owed the ridge. I looked until seeing felt like work again, and I listened to make sure the shape of the missing sound didn't turn into a habit I would trust. When the minute hand slid past the 7, I pressed the transmit once without speaking and listened for the world to answer with its own small arithmetic. East presented, Burn Ridge late, South Shoulder refused. The numbers sat on my tongue like a prayer I was not sure I believed in anymore, but I said them to myself anyway and felt the comfort that comes from a pattern that holds even when it holds wrong. At 01:08, the corridor of quiet shouldered past the north catwalk and kept walking toward the saddle, like it had a schedule. The tower's hum came back thin, grateful for work. I marked it and tried to breathe like someone whose night still belonged to numbers. The barometer held at 29.69, a lie that pretended to be steadiness, and the wind vane, insulted by my cheek, stayed north-northeast as if loyalty were a weather pattern. I set the Osborne to 0 and left my hands off it, a private truce. The field glasses rode my chest. The crank radio slept on its scuffed circle. I keyed the mic once and counted, East Echo present, Burn Ridge late by half a syllable, South Shoulder silent, and I filed the little arithmetic away like a bedtime prayer. At 01:23, the wind gauge did a thing I have only seen twice in 8 seasons. The vane quivered, the little cups that had been pretending not to matter slowed, then stopped and held. 0. Dead calm should have read on my face as a broad quiet, the kind that makes a moth's wing feel like weather. Instead, the right cheek cooled first as always. A narrow band grazed my knees from west to east, and then reversed as if someone had turned a handle. The instrument said nothing was moving. My skin said something moved with manners. I made the slate carry only what would travel. 01:23 wind speed 0, vane steady, NNC, cheek flow persists, knee band reversals continue, then smaller and useless to anyone else. Motion without momentum. I wanted to be the kind of lookout who trusts the glass. I rapped both the aneroid's face with a fingernail and watched the needle pretend not to have heard me. I uncapped my pencil and wrote a tiny vertical 0 next to the wind line, like a witness signature. That was when the Osborne's ring trembled under the floorboards. Not a slip, more a soft click you feel in the feet than hear. I looked without touching. The hairline had not moved from 0. The pedestal hummed on my palm when I set it there, and then, in a patience that felt deliberate, let the hum back into wood. I put my eye on the south again, because I refused to let a good column teach me shame. The apron beyond the granite blisters wore its faint, left-to-right banding still, careful as a conveyor. No build. A star eased into one band, dulled for a breath shorter than any number I could give, then came out again bright and smug. I wrote nothing. Document insert, log slate, right margin, 0131, echo test, E equal prompt, burn equal plus 1/2 sil, S equals 0, 0137, wind, 0, vane, NNE, borrow 29.69, 0141, knee band WE, steady, reverses at 8 count, 014, larch bow, center out, single. At 0146, the tower became a lesson in subtraction. The corridor slipped back along the east edge of the catwalk, took the hum with it, and unthreaded the ordinary sounds as if they were beads on a string. Moth, gone. Cricket, gone. Timber talk, gone. The only sound left was the tiny rasp of the pencil in my grip when I shifted it, and even that felt like theft. I walked one step into the quiet and lifted the crank radio off its circle. In the line, it was just weight in my hand. Out of it, set back on wood, it gave its faint, lazy coil hum like a beast snoring in straw. I slid it back and forth across the boundary, without turning it on. A little field experiment no one will applaud. In, no hum. Out, hum. I wrote the time without comment because a comment makes a theory, and a theory gets you killed by your own mouth. Echo 4, south desk, the night voice said with that softer cadence you save for late. Status. Green, I said. Wind 0 by instrument. Localized flows persist at face and knee. Corridor continues EW, drifting north and south. No fire, no storm. Copy, she said, pencil honest. I took the plumb bob and hung it over the Osborne's crosshair to remind myself what a straight line is. The bob centered and held, indifferent to night. I set it swinging gently to taste for coupling. The swing died on its own time. The tower's hum changed pitch a hair anyway, like it had heard a joke in another room. At Euro 202, the wind gauge's cups ticked a single, polite quarter turn and then decided their mind had not been made up after all. The arrow stayed N and E. I stepped onto the south catwalk and tried a different trick we don't write down because it sounds like superstition. I closed my eyes and counted how long it took the right cheek to cool, then the left, then the back of the neck. Right arrived at 3, left at 5, back at never. No sound under it, no smell to ride it. The air and motion carried no story. I wanted a fact that would let me choose between call and silence. I took the washer from the repair tin, held it at shoulder height over the same board as before, and let it fall. In the corridor, the ring died against the wood. Out of it, the washer found the tower's threads and rang back to the legs. I tried it over the Osborne's pedestal. The metal answered with a tone that matched the pedestal's hum for 2 beats, then lost it. I put the washer away before I taught myself to like the sound. The map, my last old friend, refused me with good manners. I laid a straight edge across the corridor's measured edges and extended the lines both ways. On paper, they crossed the apron, cut the low saddle, and went on to the west road where Bravo 1 had turned around an hour ago. In the window, the line did the same. When I rotated the sheet 6 degrees, the creek under the larch forgave the grove and met it. Squared, they quarreled again. Spatial drift should be a party trick. Parallax, hunger, sleep. The slate got the clean version. 0211. Corridor edges cited. 089, 094, 269, 274. Projection aligns with West Road and Low Saddle. At 0217, the radio gave 2 carrier bursts, 2 seconds apart. I answered with call sign, got nothing, waited, got a third. The rhythm matched the crank radio's tick from earlier, minus the scrap of hum. My thumb hovered over the transmit. The moral pressure lived between calling a pattern and letting a pattern invite me to name it. I wrote the syllables out. Tick, tick. Tick. Then I closed the slate and watched the south shoulder, where the echo refuses to live. The thing about refusal is that it has a shape. I pressed the transmit key once to click the room and counted. East, prompt, burn, late. South, the absence arrived on time, exactly where the soft double should have lived, a punctual gap. I could count it now like a note. I wrote, not proud and not ashamed. South absence regular, not random. Arrival equals missing. At Euro 229, the barometer, which had behaved like a creature with a thought, sighed another hair to 29.68. I tapped the glass. It did not twitch. I took it off its nail, laid it flat on the map, 29.69. Upright on the sill, 29.68. Upright on the Osborne, 29.67. One wall. The needle liked steel. I put it back on the wall, where the tower's wood could hold it to whatever vow the night was making me. I was not going to hand a mechanic a story about brass in love with brass. I walked the catwalk one more slow circle to keep the body from becoming just eyes. On the east, the larch gave their deep center-first bow, held it longer than polite, then rose. When they rose, a smell came across the catwalk. Clean, wet rock for a breath. Then that paper-dried too-fast tang, the taste of pennies hiding behind it. I set the back of my hand on the rail. The wood was cooler than the air. A small tactile oddity only my skin would honor. Document insert, radio log, scribbled, 0233, S desk, advisories Enil, me, green no fire, note, wind, 0, instrument calm, flows persist. Copy, she said, after I told her only what would pass as fact. Dawn push predicted for 5. If you need company before then, we can wake the West crew. A negative, I said, and pictured other boots on my ladder and the way the corridor might make room for them. I would not ask another person to learn what my cheek had learned. At Euro 241, the wind gauge needle, if you can call the little pointer a needle, eased off 0 a whisper, and then returned to the line like a man who stands, remembers his promise, and sits. The vane stayed NE. The Osborne at 0 looked like a clock face without hands. I let the ring rest there, hairline on the brass pip, as if true were a place you could camp until the world decided to come back to it. I tried a last star occultation to see if the column that had taught me patience would forgive me. A bright point near the apron's right margin stepped into the faint banding and came out on time. No lag, no dulling. Good. The night reserves the right to decline a pattern. Below, the firebreak's mineral belt made its pale circle. My 3 ovals from earlier had softened at the rim, dust settling back into its own story. I lifted the field glasses out of habit and found the places where a vole had written a short sentence and then given up, where a ground spider's high wire still caught starlight. No new sign crossed. I let the glasses drop and listened. The corridor passed somewhere north, sound damping and returning like a tide's edge, crossed and uncrossed by a child. 0257, I wrote. Wind, 0, borrow, 2968. Echo south, absent regular, corridor or north. Larch, bow, X1. Smell wet rock paper, transient. Instruments normal by their own stubborn definitions. The minute hand found the 3. The tower made the small settling sound that a room makes when it chooses to be itself again after an interruption. I put my palm flat on the Osborne. No hum. I lifted it and felt the soft ghost of it at the heel for a heartbeat, then nothing. A person could sleep in a night like that and be forgiven. My job is to tax forgiveness. I pressed the transmit once and counted the answers. The east answer honest, the burn late by its half syllable, the south refusing on time. And I said the numbers to myself as if they were a prayer that did not require belief, only repetition. Then I set the ring to 0, because sometimes 0 is the only place you can stand and still call it work. Sometime after 3, the night loosened the knot it had been holding and let a faint chill walk the catwalk boards. The wind gauge could not be bothered to admit it. The cups idled at 0, the vane clung to north-northeast like a stubborn habit, and my right cheek still cooled first the way it had all day. I gave the Osborne a palm laid flat across its warm brass and kept it at 0 because 0 was the only position that felt honest. The barometer hung at 29.68 and pretended patience. The tower hummed in the lower register again. A thin line of tone that you notice only after you realize you've been listening for it. I stepped outside to let my eyes reset and took a slow walk around the catwalk with the field glasses idle against my chest. the crank radio asleep on its scuffed circle. The east larch stood without bow or whisper, black lace against a salt of stars. When I reached the south window, I leaned on the rail and let my gaze flatten the distance until the apron behind the granite blisters became a single brushstroke. The faint banding I had been living with all night drifted left to right in that steady conveyor way, a motion that never owned itself as wind. I forced myself to blink and count. When I opened my eyes again, a smear showed where there had been only banding. Pale, powdery, the color smoke takes when a punk of old duff exhale learns to be a column. It rose a little, collapsed on itself, and spread as a low, soft fan that clung to the apron like breath on cool glass. I eased the Osborne off its truce and let the ring turn, slow and exact, hairline on the right shoulder of the middle blister. The number landed where it had every time since afternoon, 1.5 degrees north of where my notes want the world to sit. I held the sight in that wrongness and watched the fan take a shape that should have been ash settling. The wind, if it had any intention at all, would have carried ash eastward and thin. Instead, the fan flowed uphill against the shoulder by inches, then paused in a trembling that made the shape blur without moving. I put the glasses up and let the world come to me. The fan had texture the way sifted flour does when someone breathes on it. Inside the fan, small shadowless eddies turned on themselves and never left the patch they belonged to, as if whatever they were turning around did not exist in air. On the catwalk, the tower's note went thin, and then I realized it had disappeared entirely in a stripe, just wide enough to hold both my boots if I set them heel to toe. I stepped out of it, and the hum returned, stepped back, and it died. The corridor of quiet had come home again. I kept one foot in and one out, and listened to the difference. In the quiet, the smear over the apron looked less like ash and more like a field of light, the wrong color. Something laid over the face of the slope and then pressed with an invisible hand. I tried the least dramatic test I know. I let my knuckle tap the rail 3 times. Out of the corridor, the wood threw a clear thock and sent the sound into the legs. In it, the tap was swallowed as if someone had put felt under my hand. The radio stayed properly silent, but when I lifted the crank radio and set it in the quiet, its soft coil hum went out like a candle that had decided to be a stone. Back in ordinary air, the little snore returned. It was enough of a thing to make me want to call someone, and enough of a nothing to keep me from pressing the mic. I told myself I would wait for a sign that would travel without my skin. I got one, or something like it, at the base of the tower. I was halfway down the ladder, light dark at my thigh, when the smell met me at knee height, as clean as rain on a road and as unearned. Wet rock, pennies hiding behind it, a sheet of paper dried too fast. At the inner edge of the fire break, where my 3 wrong ovals had crossed before midnight, a new dust lay faintly over the mineral. I crouched without turning the light on and used the back of my wrist for a gauge. The dust felt cooler than the ground that held it, and when I drew a finger through it, the groove closed slowly, as if the dust had more to do with frost than powder. I touched the rim and it smeared against my skin in a way ash does when it clings damp. But the night had not brought damp, and when I lifted my fingers to my nose, there was none of the sweet leaf-rot memory ash carries, none of the burnt resin bite. It was almost odorless, a laboratory sort of clean that made the tongue remember batteries. I stood and breathed through my nose to rinse the story, then drew a circle in the dust with one fingertip and watched the edge for how a grain calms. Ash fall always records the wind in the way its motes settle. This film recorded nothing. The circle I made relaxed evenly all the way around. No feathering leeward, no faint tail. When I stepped back over my own boot mark, the rim of the tread should have kicked a tongue of powder in the wind's direction. The tread filled itself in like the mineral wanted to forget me. The knee-height band rolled across my shin from west to east, reversed at 8, and came back through the same place with the same temperature. It had less to do with movement than with a decision. I gave up on trying to lift a sample the honest way. A plastic bag makes noise in a quiet this clean, so I used the scrap of card I'd traced with earlier and coaxed a thin skin of dust onto it like I was catching a moth. The sheet took it without fuss. Underneath, the mineral was smooth where it should have recorded my scraping. A vole line ran to the edge of the fire break and then became a clean absence. When I turned the card sideways, the dust behaved like flour until the moment it should have fallen. Then it hung for a breath and let go in a single, soft release that didn't leave streaks on the cardboard. I slid the card into the tower and laid it on the table, as if the weight of small, wrong things could be made safe by insisting they stay on paper. Back at the window, the smear over the apron was still there, tightened now into patches that held the shape of what you'd call ash heaps if a windless night were capable of making them. I put the Osborne on the right shoulder and kept the hairline fast and simple, then lifted the field glasses and found a star on the far side that would walk behind the smear if the world cooperated. It eased into the patch and dulled a shade that made me wonder if my eye was inventing. It came out a full breath later than the sky math allowed. I watched another, and that one refused to dull, but still lagged a heartbeat and then returned its bite. Both behaviors felt like honesty and like insult. When the radio finally spoke, it did it in the smallest way. 2 carrier bursts without voice, spaced like someone counting to themselves. I pressed the key long enough to make my own click and let go. The east ridge returned its clean reply. The burn ridge lagged by half a syllable, a rhythm I could clap to now. The south shoulder gave me the now familiar answer that isn't one, the precise gap where an echo belongs. I said the counts under my breath anyway and wrote them without decoration. The facts feel less lonely when they look like a list you refuse to make into bullet points. The barometer gave up another hair to 29.67 and stopped pretending. I took it off its nail, held it flat in my hands, and watched the needle climb a whisper, and then settle where it wanted. Higher on the map case, lower on the steel of the Osborne, lowest when I put it back where the wood could hear it. I didn't write that test. I let the earlier underlines carry the weight. I set the barometer down with more care than it needed and returned to the south. Ash that isn't ash ought to at least glint when a beam touches it. I cupped the flashlight and laid a cloth over the lens, then let the smallest wedge of light slide out toward the far slope to make a white line across the air. The beam did nothing to the smear, but the corridor on my own catwalk went to work on the light. As the wedge reached the stripe of quiet at my feet, it thinned, and the penumbra closed in like a pair of fingers pinched together. Beyond the stripe, the wedge fattened and behaved. I shut the light, guilt in my fist, and listened to the tower breathe. What I wanted then was an argument, a gust that would take the smear and carry it where wind takes everything that admits to being air. The vane, stubborn in its little north-northeast romance, refused to help me. The cups, after an hour at 0, clicked a quarter turn and failed to commit. Down in the firebreak, the thin film on mineral did not move, except to erase the groove of my finger until it looked as if I had not touched it at all. I told myself that real ash is patient, that you can sweep it 9 times and it will lay back down again somewhere else. But I could not persuade the night to call this thing ash. For 30 minutes I watched, then I made myself a bargain. If the smear thickened into anything I could order help to, I would upgrade and be ready to pay for the insult if it unbuilt. If it did the softer, stranger work it seemed to love, staying and not being, I would carry the shape and give it to the morning without asking anyone to spend the rest of their night learning my skin. The tower seemed to accept that arrangement. The hum slipped 1 shade higher and held there like a wire tuned for an orchestra that would never arrive. The larch at the east line bowed once, a deep center-first dip that brought with it a mouthful of wet rock smell that left no damp on the board. I wrote what a person could read out loud without learning my pulse. Pressure easing to 29.67, calm at the gauge. Local flows continue. Southern sector shows persistent low pale haze over apron, unresponsive to nominal wind. Visibility otherwise unlimited, no active flame, observation ongoing. Then, for myself alone, I added a single word I could defend only with this room, ash-like. The hyphen kept me honest. If anyone asked later, I could say I had described a behavior, not granted a name. By 4, the smear had thinned and separated into smaller patches that behaved more like a failing trick. The corridor eased north and let the tower hum reclaim the boards. The crank radio sighed its coil noise and forgave the shelf for being wood. The vane loosened its loyalty a finger's width toward west, and then, with what felt like relief, began to tremble for real downslope. My cheek did its part. The right cooled, then the left, then the back of the neck learned dawn was somewhere out there rehearsing. The firebreak kept its pale belt. The thin dust I had stroked into a circle forgot my finger. The 3 ovals from midnight were now only hints, then not even that. And the mineral looked the way a swept floor looks when a house is ready to be shown. I put my palm on the Osborne a last time and found the note in the steel the way you find your own pulse. I set the ring to 0, so the day, when it decided to become day, would have a place to start. The ridge would be the ridge again, and the map would meet the creek on paper even if the window preferred an argument. I stood with my hands quiet and watched the light begin to sift into the saddle where the corridor had gone, as if it had an appointment there. If this was ash, it belonged to a fire that didn't learn heat. If it wasn't, the name was a debt I was not going to pay before the sun put its hand on the roof. I keyed the mic for the calmest kind of truth. Echo 4, green, no visible smoke, pressure slightly down, unusual haze south remains intermittent, no fire behavior, wind calm at instrument, local flows present. Continuing observation till dawn. The desk answered with the measured pencil of a voice half in, the next day already. I set the mic down, wrote the hour, and let the tower keep the rest. Dawn seeped in through the timber, the way water learns a crack. The first light didn't arrive. It rehearsed. I stood with a palm on the Osborne, ring at 0, and felt the steel hold a small, unambitious warmth as the roof took on the day's first thin heat. The wind gauge tried bravery. The cups clicked twice, paused, and then began an honest, slow spin. The vane loosened its dead loyalty and edged toward west by north, as if embarrassed by the night's stubborn enzani. My right cheek cooled first out of habit, then both cheeks learned the same new breath at once. It was almost a return to rules. I pressed the mic and kept my voice level. Echo 4, green, no visible smoke. Pressure 29.67, slow fall. Haze south intermittent, no phenon behavior. Wind light westerly at instrument. Continuing observation. The south desk answered with the pencil of a person who has watched nights eat their own footprints. Copy Echo 4, relief and mechanic scheduled for 9. The word mechanic put a name on the morning that belonged to the kind of truth you can lay a wrench to. Below, the firebreak's pale belt had dried into something unpersuaded by memory. The circle I'd drawn in the dust had forgotten my finger. The 3 ovals I'd traced at midnight were a suspicion only I could still see. I went down the ladder with the flashlight dark and let my hand skim each rung to tell me if the night had left any charge in the wood. The tower answered with the small creaks that belonged to temperature, not to whatever else. At the base, I crouched at the inner mineral edge. When I blew across the surface, a faint skin lifted and lay back down evenly, no feathering to honor a wind. A vole had written a fresh, neat line to the ring and then decided to be a vole somewhere else. I set 2 fingers in the place where the ovals had been. The ground felt cool by a hair, not enough for weather. Back up top, I set the Osborne on the south again, because discipline is a posture you can hold even when you are tired. The hairline met the right shoulder of the middle blister at 194 laftasars and refused to apologize for the day before. I checked Coyote Gate at 17 dig, the old burn at 262 dig, the broken snag at 79 dig, clean, honest, obedient to their grease pencil ticks. The disagreement south kept its degree and a half, like a person who has decided to sit in the wrong chair and call it theirs. I clicked the mic once for the echo test and counted unconsciously. East returned crisp 1-2. The burn ridge was late by its half syllable, polite about it now that daylight took excuses away. The south shoulder gave me the shape of refusal at the exact instant a reply would have been due, an empty, punctual double that had the weight of sound without its body. I wrote the counts, and the room let me have the tiny comfort of repetition. At 0511, the corridor found me a last time. It didn't take the whole tower, just a ribbon across the north catwalk boards as thin as a belt, drifting westward slow enough that you could follow with a toe. Sound damped in that stripe and sprang whole on either side, and the hum went out of the pedestal as if the note had been folded and slipped into a pocket. I slid the crank radio across the sill, and, once more, inside the stripe it forgot to snore. When the ribbon reached the ladder opening, it quivered and then continued, precise as a chalk line. I sighted its center against the Osborne as if it were a ridge. It read 093 dig, moving 273 dig, the same breath north of true it had preferred in the dark. I read the edges and kept the numbers small so they would fit in daylight. Down valley, the flats took on that rose color that rinses a night of its claims. If there had been a fire, even a sulking one, the light would have spelled it. The smear over the apron untied itself into nothing and let the granite blisters be simple stone again. A hawk found a thermal honest enough to honor, shouldered into it, and banked over the east larch. The line bowed, a deep center-first nod that ended in a ripple toward the edges, and then they stood without guilt. The wet rock smell lifted once, a mouthful you could argue had been dew. The paper dried too fast taste hid behind it, and then chose not to come. I wrote the time and the small forgivenesses. Dawn flows established, light west zephyr, haze south gone to clear. The barometer refused to join in. It eased to 29.66 with a satisfaction that did not belong to the sky I could see. I rapped the glass with my fingernail. Soft. Reprimand without theater. The needle shivered and held. I took it down, laid it flat, watched it climb a whisper, set it on the Osborne, and watched it fall that same whisper, then put it back on its nail where the wood could keep the number to itself. I did not write the experiment. The mechanic would have enough to talk to me about. At Euro 6:02, Bravo 1 checked in. New voice on their road, cheerful with the kind of relief mornings put in men. Echo 4, we're on West Spur. Clear air, no smoke, temps down a couple. Your sector reads pretty. C looked and saw what he meant. The apron's pale slope was a clean sheet. The saddle beyond it wearing the first star, as if the night had never measured a corridor there. I wanted that to be the end of it, a sweep of the hand across a board. The Echo South remained absent on time. The map's creak under the larch missed its window meeting by its dozen yards, unless I turned the paper 6 degrees and lied. I ate because the body will invent patterns to fill an empty stomach. Coffee went honest on the second pour. I oiled the ladder's latch, tightened 2 obvious screws, rolled the plumb bob between finger and thumb, and gave the place a look the way you look at a room before guests, asking it to be kind. The tower hummed in its lower register and stayed there. No coquetry, no beat-for-beat courtship with my bones. When I set my palm to the Osborne this time, the steel's note did not follow to the heel. It stayed where it belonged. The first small cloud of the day formed lazy over the north shoulder, pretended it was a thought worth saying, and then forgot itself. Dispatch's day voice came back on. A new pencil. Earlier footsteps. Echo 4, morning status. Green, I said, and let the word hold. Anomalies overnight persisted. No smoke, no fire behavior, instrument wind returning to expected, pressure slightly down, while brief mechanic. I could hear the pause shaped like a square on a form. Copy, bring him chapter and verse, she said, not unkindly. At 08:11, I went down to sweep the fire break, because you don't hand a crew a ring with your night written in it. The rake put clean parallel grooves into the mineral. Where the 3 wrong ovals had crossed, the sand lifted with a reluctance you'd expect from damp, but the tines came away dry, no clumping, no cling. In that stretch, the rake sounded different, quieter by a hair, then found its ordinary scrape again. I couldn't have proven the sound to another person if they'd been standing beside me. The mechanic came up the last stretch of road at 09:04, boots bringing dust and a comfort that belongs to tools. His bag hit the catwalk with a weight that made the tower's joints clear their throats. He ran a hand along the ring's rim the way you greet a horse, checked the clamp, spun the Osborne to let it breathe. You've kept her right, he said, almost to the metal. He set his little bubble level dead center and tapped the screws until the bubble admitted we lived where we lived. He cited Coyote Gate, the burn, the snag, made the same grease pencil ticks I had, and smiled because they matched. And south? He asked, eyes already on the right shoulder of the middle blister. He cited and read 194 hectares. There it is, I said, careful not to load the words. He tried my stance, then his. Light tricks off the apron, he said, not dismissing me, just putting the world back where tools like it. He loosened the ring, brought it back to 0, returned to the gate, tapped each foot, nodded to the bubble, and called the day good. Your barometer wants a bath, he added, wrapping the glass and watching it flinch. Sticky. I'll relube the linkage next resupply. I didn't give him my tests with steel and wood. I told him the number on the face and the rate of the fall. He penciled what he could own and let the rest be mine. You call anything we can put in the book? He asked. I thought of ash that wasn't ash, and echoes that arrive on time as absences and corridors that silence a tower, one board wide and move with the precision of a chalk snap. I thought of 3 ovals that met a line and decided to end there, and a creek that met a grove only when the map was turned to a lie. No smoke, I said. No fire. South echo odd. Pressure down. I'll file a note. And he tightened a screw he would have tightened anyway, checked bolts that had not betrayed us, and told me my ring sang like a church bell, if you let it. Keep your eyes, he said, the blessing of the guild, and went back down into the light. After he left, I did the one ritual I had kept for the end of a night like this since my first season. I set the Osborne to 0 and laid the plumb bob on its crosshair so the weight line kissed the tiny center punch on the brass. The bob hung true. I pressed the transmit once and listened. East replied with the exactness that makes a morning gentler than it has any right to be. The Burn Ridge, warmed at last, returned almost on time, no more than a quarter syllable late, and made a case for forgiveness. The South Shoulder answered with its punctual gap, a double of nothing, arriving exactly where sound should have lived, as if the air there had decided to be a wall. I said the counts under my breath because habits make a person. In the South Glass, the apron wore its ordinary face. The hawk climbed, the larch did not bow, the saddle let the sun through. The corridor did not show itself as a stripe anyone would believe. But when I stepped onto the north catwalk and closed my eyes for a breath, I could still feel a ribbon of cool thinness past the knees and keep its bearing toward the west road that Bravo 1 likes to curse. The ribbon was fainter than it had been at midnight and steadier than it had been at 2. I opened my eyes, and it had turned back into air. On the slate, in the small blank at the bottom right that I saved for the last thing I can afford to write, I put what would travel. Night anomalies observed, no ignition, monitoring. Then, in the line below, I wrote the words that would only ever make sense to me. The line didn't close. I set the pencil down and let the room have its sound back. The tower's hum settled to the note I know. The wind took a position it could defend. The barometer hesitated over a number it would argue with all day. I stood with a palm on the Osborne and looked south until looking felt like work again. When the sun finally put a flat, warm hand on the roof, I watched the far slope hard enough to convince myself of the ordinary. The ridge kept being ridge. The map met its creek only on paper, unless I turned the sheet 6 degrees and lied. Down in the fire break, my rake lines wrote the morning into mineral in parallel strokes. Somewhere that I could point to on the chart, but not in the air, a reply arrived on time and refused to exist. That felt like the truest thing I owned. I left it where it belonged, between 2 bearings and a habit of listening, and I waited for whatever the day would decide to call wind.